Today we'll be doing some more regular puzzles of the timed rated puzzles, which is what we did last time. We were getting pretty close to breaking into the 2,800 rating range, so it's definitely the goal for today. So if we solve some good puzzles today, it should work. So, looking at this first puzzle, immediately I'm taking note of a couple things. One, there is a hanging piece, and two, if we were to take that piece, black might have a counter attack. And that looks like that could just be perpetual. White has to come here. Then there's queen here. If you come back, it's still here. You're forced into the corner. So we're not in time to take this knight, it looks like. But we might be in time to trade queens and then attack this rook. And then if we look one move further, if black makes a move to promote, that could be kind of annoying, actually. So we would, in that case, have to come back and take that pawn. So do we have better? What if we took this with the queen? So that if here, we could come here. I guess I was implicitly thinking of the rook for no reason in particular. So if we take with the queen check, we have this defensive idea. So what would black do in that case? I actually don't see it. Maybe that's just the solution. Because this would be nice too if it wasn't so problematic that this pawn was far advancing. Here, if there's no perpetual, then that's just the solution. Alright, simple puzzle actually. This should be the more natural piece to take with anyways, because it leaves our pawn defended. Somehow when I was looking at this, I wanted to trade queens. I'm winning the piece, I want to trade down, so I inherently thought of taking with the rook, leaving the queens open to trade. But having this defensive resource is just more important. Let's move on to the next puzzle. So this looks like the theme is pretty clear here. We definitely need to make a passed pawn. So how are we going to do that? Well, our king is already supporting a pawn to advance. And when our pawn gets to this square, it's going to come with check, which means we're going to be able to play immediately to this square, and white won't be in time to stop us. So if we imagine a scenario where we could get our pawn here, then we just win. I have the feeling that it's going to be this pawn first, but just to calculate here, if here it takes, and takes, right? So when we play this pawn forward, we're actually helping to shepherd this pawn, which is why I think we want to go here first. White has no option but to take, because if we just take this pawn for free and have a massive 3 pawns, the bishop won't be able to stop them. Also the idea that we would then be pushing to where white's king couldn't stop us. But when he takes here, then we can push our pawn here, and that's coming with this threat. Once we get our pawn here, we just win. And if white comes to stop us, then we can take this pawn safely, because we're not dropping this pawn anymore. So it's just here, here, and now we're just winning. Alright, well we already got our target for today. Let's just see if we can hold on to that target rating for a few more puzzles. So what's going on here? Well, the first thing to note is that while this queen might be hanging, there is a very nasty checkmate threat, where we have the knight covering this square, the bishop covering these squares, the knight's supporting this bishop here. But we can't even take the knight because there's a checkmate. So there's some nasty stuff going on for against black's king. So our move should do something to simplify. And simplifying might just be enough, because we are currently up in exchange, it seems. If we count the material, we have 3 pieces and a rook for 4 pieces. So how can we simplify here? We could just try to protect this pawn. And just the merit of protecting this pawn is that we are still attacking the queen. And the queen is finding it difficult to stay on this file, which means that if the queen is forced to move off the file somewhere, let's say here, then we could take the knight at that point and then have a follow-up of bishop g7 to eliminate this bishop. Maybe this would just be winning. As long as we don't hang some sort of queen g6 idea, threatening mate with the pawn being pinned. So, I mean, this would be a very simple move. And the reason why you might play rook to b7 rather than rook to c7 is that rook to c7 potentially allows the queen to stay on this file, and then we can't take the knight. So that could be an interesting idea. Is that maybe just the best move? I'm trying to see what other options we have. Another thing to think about is that even in this scenario where we go here, and queen moves and we take the knight and knight, how are we defending against this threat against the g6 pawn? Because we already ruled out bishop g7. At that point we would need something a bit stronger. Perhaps we could go just king h7. And it's not like white can come back to the h file to do any checks. And even if the rook were to come in, we would still be able to block. So this is going to be my solution, I think, rook b7 rather than rook c7. Ah, that's a shame. Or the simplest of all the moves, which I totally overlooked, which is just I can take this piece and then win the queen. Well, that's embarrassing. I got so content with the fact that I was already up material that I just forgot that all I have to do is prevent the checkmate, and then the queen is hanging. Yeah, I definitely deserve to lose 14 points for that. Sometimes you just have a blind spot. Alright, we have 2 more puzzles left. I think we're right where we started. So if we do these successfully, then we should just barely make it back to our target goal for today. So hopefully you, as the viewer, got that previous puzzle and we're just shaking your head at me. Here, Okay, question number one. Why can't we just take this pawn? It seems very strong. White has to come back with the king somewhere. What would we do instead? We do have to be ready for the fact that white wants to play rook g7, supported by the bishop, with a mate threat of rook h8. This is a check, which is nice. And if we were to just take this with the rook, well, two things. One, we'd have to be ready for losing our other rook, and we'd have to be saying that, oh, we have some really strong follow-up here. But after this check, and maybe the king can just come to c1 or something, or d1. Not really sure what that strong follow-up would be. We don't currently have rook b2 either. So after takes, white has a couple of moves here. And at that point, what are we doing as black? Potentially, we could try to bring our bishop in, depending on where white goes. For instance, if the king comes back here, we're not pushing here, because then the king comes back and blockades everything. But we might not be ready for d2 in that event either. So maybe then we play bishop here. This isn't white's only move. White could also make moves to play rook c7 with that same checkmate threat. But that's when a bishop on this diagonal might help to come back and guard. Well, okay. I shouldn't just take this. I want to solve the whole puzzle first. But I do have some feeling that it's here and then maybe following up with bishop to c4. And if the king came to either of these squares, then maybe we just push d2. Force the bishop to give itself up, and then we can bring our other rook in somehow and not be worried about mate. Right, so here, okay. So my thoughts were correct. We're going to force this bishop to give itself up. We'll get our other rook in, and then our bishop will guard against the mate. So we need 7 points from the last one, which means we have to solve pretty fast. Okay, this is going to be a checkmate puzzle. That much is pretty obvious when you have a king that's in the middle of the board with most of the pieces still left. So let's look at some forcing variations here. A couple things to consider. Bishop here is one consideration. Pawn here is another consideration. The idea of the bishop would be better because it covers this retreat square. So king has to take the knight, at which point, what check do we have? This is a check that we have. King comes over. Then we could play b4. If king were to take that, then we would certainly checkmate somehow with queen a4. So after bishop takes here, here, check, king here, Do we have a checkmate? Well, at the very least, we can play here, check. Because our queen is coming into a4, black basically has to take twice, and then we can get our queen in somehow. Queen c1 maybe? That should be enough. I'll just double check one more time. I wanted queen a4 in my calculation. If I just play rook b1, maybe the king comes back and I don't have another check. Just shy. Okay, well then I'll definitely keep doing these puzzles in the future to raise the rating. Started out a little higher, or we finished a little higher than we started. But yeah, there is no excuse for this oversight of queen takes f6. Kind of embarrassing. So, a somewhat successful day. Hopefully the calculations were instructive on all the puzzles that I got right. And we'll keep doing this in future days.